Ladies, gentlemen, am I often forgotten, but certainly not by me. Scriptures the full. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to my RuneScape 3 DPS guide, Range Edition. In this guide, I'll be covering the equipment and rotations I use to do DPS in this game with the combat style, and also be going over different situations based on what gear you may or may not have. This will include things such as rotations for either dual wield or two-hand camping, how I would go about switching between the two, and introduction of different eofs and other miscellaneous pieces of range gear as we get towards best in slot. As a quick reminder, this is completely what I do, and these are my rotations. These are not spreadsheet rotations. I will never claim to be the best ranger in this game, and to be fair, this is probably my weakest combat style. However, I've gotten some pretty decent times at bosses, and this is just what I would do for using this combat style. So, go ahead and get into this guide. Alrighty, so getting into this guide here, just like last time, this is going to be a live format style of video. My inputs and keyboard will be shown in the upper left-hand corner. And I'll just go ahead and be discussing everything in sort of a kind of live style format. Now, moving on to the worn equipment, what exactly do I have for range gear? Looking at my inventory, as far as I can tell, this is pretty much best in slot. I can't really think of too many other things to add in off the top of my head. So let's go ahead and get into it. I have Blightbounds, an elite Serenic that's kind of a staple for top-end range. Blightbounds allow for continuous use of eofs, meaning that you don't have a one-tick delay in between eof usages. So you can back-to-back ECB and then SGB, or ECB into Debo, and it's just a much more fluid style. However, I do also have an ECB. This is mostly used for in send shot if you want to chin send. However, who knows if that's still going to be in the game in the near future. However, that's there. And also for mutated dazing shot. I have a offhand Abilites. This is just a recent addition that has chroming 4 = 2 on it. This is my chroming swap for Ricochet. And I finally upgraded to a Blight. I just had a bunch of spare cash lying around, so I went ahead and picked one up since the prices have kind of dropped. And it's nice, honestly, for saving on bolts, being that Blights both have a 25% chance to save a criminal bolt when the effect is active. So, if you have a Corroming swap over a Ascension, you do save those little bit of extra bolts, and it can help reduce the cost of bolt usage. However, for me, it's more so the fact of I'm lazy, and I don't really like refilling my quiver, every hour or so is what it seems. Other things would include a SGB. This is mostly for applying Blackstone arrow effects on certain bosses, i.e. Telos, or if you're at AOD or something, or anywhere where you really need the extra accuracy. Virago comes to mind. Next, this could be useful, however, most of the time you don't really need to do it, and it's just kind of there. This is also more of a off-style thing, where if you're on magic or melee, it's nice to just have a one-click SGB spec, and that's about it. The main elephant in the room is also I have a second armor set. I need to redo these perks. They're kind of outdated, and I need to change a few things on them. Mostly I want to get, I believe it's Lucky 6 Absorbative 1 or Lucky 4 Absorb 2 on here to make it a little bit easier to deal with ECB usage. And also, I need to replace the Imp4 probably with Imp4 Devo 4 instead of mobile, because we now can take advantage of the fact that with Hydrix Bolts, range has basically infinite adrenaline based on RNG, so there is improv there. However, you can kind of think of that way, and then we can use something like Shadow's Grace to take care of the mobile effect, or just have a Bladed Dive swap. But yes, this is my standard range at normal bosses, and then this is my range set for elite dungeons, being the fact that it has Dragon Slayer, Undead Slayer, and Genocidal on it. Now, as far as jewelry is concerned, I have a SGB, an ECB, and a Darkbow EOF. All three of those specs are in EOFs. 99% of the time, with range, I never use SGB in its raw form. It's specifically for BSA stacks, like stated previously. I always use the SGB inside of the EOF. And honestly, for a long time, I did not have ECB inside of an EOF. And I can say the quality of life of putting it into the EOF once you have Blights, 100% worthwhile. I honestly can't recommend it enough. It has made life just much more fluid. It made range a much more fluid combat style. It felt much less clunky. Overall, 10 out of 10. Cinderbanes are best in slot for all combat styles as long as the boss is poisonable, so I have that here. And then if you can't poison your target, I would say Nightmare Gloves or Enhanced Nightmare Gloves, depending on where you're, depending on if you actually want to pay for the Enhanced. Honestly, the Enhanced is kind of a flex thing. There's not really much different. I think it's one strength bonus difference, so honestly, it doesn't matter if they're enhanced or not. But if you have an artifact lying around from Glaycore, you might as well just slap it on your nightmares. As far as pocket slot is concerned, I use all three of these kind of interchangeably. Scripture of Full is nice. It is comparable with Grim in terms of damage output, and it costs a lot less to operate. However, I'm kind of a sucker for using Grim. I'll use it for the big 15Ks that SGB can hit and Debo can go past the hit cap. However, that's just more of a me type thing. It's honestly not worth it to really Grim when full is there, especially for most bosses on sort of more a casual level of farming instead of, you know, trying to hunt a world record or something like that. And then Scripture of When is really nice. It synergizes well with Mechanized Chins, being that this can AoE, and obviously Chins are an AoE. And it's also very cheap to use, so it's an obvious choice for me for clearing trash mobs during a dungeon run, or if I just want to keep it cheap somewhere, like at Glaycore, for instance, Low in Rage, where it doesn't really matter if you're using full or not. The damage difference isn't going to be too great in terms of kills per hour. You know, it's not a massive thing. So if you just want to chill, toss on Scripture of When. It's really cheap to use. And that's about it. Rings, I always use Reaver's Ring if I can. If I need accuracy, I'll swap over to Stalker's Ring just because it has 30 range bonus. My Planted Feet is on a tier 80 defender. There's no particular reason for that other than it combines in a quick shield for reses and my Planted Feet into one, so for tight inventories, it is nice to have that one extra space. And then if I do need a shield, I have a T90 and I have a Spirit Shield. Honestly, I don't remember what the ideal perks for a Spirit Shield are, however, I just have Turret 4 on both of them. And now that that's pretty much everything. Now that this long-winded gear explanation let's go ahead and get into the rotations that I use, and then later on I'll go ahead and discuss the different rotations I would use based on what gear I would or would not have. As far as basic abilities are concerned with range, Needle Strike is going to be your best friend, being that it has a 5-second cooldown, just like in Magic with Greater Conch and Sonic Wave. Both Needle Strike and its two-hand counterpart, Greater Dazing Shot or Mutated Dazing Shot, if you're old school like me, they're all on 5-second cooldowns, meaning every third ability you can use them. And so for the other two abilities, I like to use things such as Grico, Snipe. Corruption Shot is a very strong basic, very underrated basic, I would say, but it's very strong. And then for targets that are stunnable and bindable, one neat trick you can do is use Binding Shot, which will bind a target for 9.6, and use something like Piercing Shot to make it a 188, because Piercing Shot on its own is a rather weak ability. I only have it here for in combination with binding or tight bindings and adrenaline building. So by itself, it's a 94%, which is pretty weak. However, if a target is bindable or stunnable, it works really well with Binding Shot. So you could do something like Needle Strike, Binding Shot, Piercing Shot, Needle Strike into a Grico, into something else. And you can kind of just keep playing with the abilities until you're at a desirable adrenaline level to go ahead and maybe move into an ECB rotation or a DES rotation, depending on what you're doing. However, that's all I pretty much do for range basics. The only difference between two-hand and dual-wield is greater dazing shot. I don't use this too often. If for some reason I'm just not paying attention to my basics and I happen to run out of basics and I don't want to use a piercing shot, I will swap to two-hand real quick and just use greater dazing because it is a 157. It can hit pretty well. It's better than using something like piercing shot, and needle is a 157 as well. The reason needle strike is powerful is that it has the special effect of the next ability after using needle strike will do a 7% increased damage. And you don't have to wear anything special for it. It's just a default effect the ability has. So I tried to combo needle strike with abilities like Grico or snipe or binding shot or something like that to make them do more damage. Sometimes I will end up combining it with corruption shot or frag shot. However, as far as I'm aware, needle strike does not affect these abilities. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that modifiers that increase damage do not work on bleeds or burns or whatever they're being classified as now. Now that we covered basic abilities, I'm going to go ahead and cover a Death Swift rotation that I would use both with and without SGB, because thresholds I mainly use inside of a Death Swiftness or inside of a ECB Spec, and I kind of have my own priorities for those, so I'll just kind of cover it all in one. So with Death Swiftness, it lasts for 30 seconds and has a 1-minute cooldown. Now with Planted Feet, if you have it on some type of swap, it will extend the time to 37 seconds for Death Swiftness, and if it's on a weapon swap, you don't suffer the penalty of 20% reduced damage while using Planted Feet. So as you start your DS, you have this equipped, and then as soon as you hit your Death Swift, you go back to your normal weapons, you're off to the races, and you're good to go. So as far as Death Swift is concerned, with a target that SGB is worthwhile on, meaning that it is greater than 3x3 in terms of its hitbox, and that's a tile reference, meaning that the boss is at minimum, the hitbox is 3 tiles on all sides around it instead of just the one that it would take up visually, or it can take up more visual tiles than the actual hitbox is concerned. Because SGB works in the sense of 1 guaranteed arrow will strike the target, and up to 4 more arrows during its Crystal Rain attack will hit in random areas around the target. And when it all works out, all said and done, if a target is at minimum a 3x3, if you're using range, meaning that you don't have to in-gen your spec, then it's pretty much worthwhile to use on a 3x3 or greater target. So with SGB being the most powerful thing in existence, pretty much, as far as any type of special attack is concerned, I try to get 2 of those off per Death Swiftness, meaning I will start my DS, do something like Grico to get some adrenaline going with Hydrix, and this is also assuming an A-pot, and then I will needle into an SGB spec. Then afterwards, I'll build up a little bit more adren with some basics and try and get off a snap and a rapid pretty much as fast as possible. After that, I typically will ECB spec inside of my DS and then go for another Grico and kind of basic back up until I have enough for tendrils and possibly a snipe. And if I have a lot of excess adrenaline, I will go ahead and use a Debo EOF. And then the other priority is another snapshot and another SGB spec. Sometimes I have enough time for a second rapid, sometimes I don't. And it's just kind of a improv thing. Range happens to be one of the most heavy improv styles where you just kind of have to send it and find out. And that's pretty much how I would do it. Now, without a without an SGB, if it's a small, like a 1x1 target, I will go ahead and just go for 2 snaps, 2 rapids, a tendrils, bunch of Debos, as many as I can fit in with Hydrix proccing, and as many Gricos as I can fit in. Being that Grico is an extremely strong ability still, I will always prioritize this as well as the other thresholds. So an example Death Swift rotation with SGB would look a little bit like this. Let's go ahead and grab the target real quick, and start my DS. Immediately into a Grico, Needle, SGB Spec. Did not get enough adrenaline immediately, so I'll hit Snap, Needle, and I'll go into a rapid fire. Another Grico. I'll go ahead and start ECB now. Needle, Snipe, into a Bleed. I'll go ahead and hit Debo. Just kind of a risk. Into a Needle. I'm looking at my SGB timer. Another Snap. Go ahead and hit the second SGB, another Needle, and then I start building up for whatever else I need to be doing. Now, honestly speaking, my Death Swiftnesses for both with SGB and without SGB, they do end up changing from time to time. Not really ever the same specific rotation, you know, specific ability by ability rotation, because range is an extremely heavy improv heavy combat style, I should say. So I usually prioritize 2 snaps, 2 SGBs. Those are the big ones. 10Ds I like to toss in, although sometimes I don't, depending on the boss and how much damage I'm taking. And a Debo or 2, and that's about it. If I can get a second rapid fire, you know, sweet, the more the better. However, getting 1 or 2 ECB specs off can really also help output damage with a DS. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and give an example rotation for what I would do if all I had was a Debo EOF and an ECB EOF, or just the physical ECB. They'll pretty much work out the same, other than the fact if you have a physical ECB that you're using, you will have a 1-tick delay in between weapon specs that are back-to-back. However, I usually don't Debo back-to-back unless I get a Relent proc, which is kind of rare. So regardless, we'll go ahead and get this rotation started. This is also useful for targets that are a 1x1 or a 2x2 hitbox if you do happen to own an SGB. Go ahead and get adrenaline here, get the targets set, and we'll go ahead and start the rotation. So I immediately Grico, into a Natty, into a Snap, and then I like to ECB rather early, and I happen to have enough adrenaline here so I can get my rapid fire off into a Grico. I got a lot of adrenaline there, so I'll go ahead and do a Debo, into a Needle, Snipe, Bleed, Needle, pop my second ECB spec, a Grico, Snap. I got some adrenaline back there so I can immediately wrap it. If I didn't, I would have used a Needle Strike. Into a Snipe, and then that's pretty much it. Now, the number of Debos I will use is kind of dependent on how much adrenaline I'm getting from my Hydrix procs. There I got a decent amount, but it wasn't like the most absolute extreme. However, I try to keep the number of Debos to about 2 per Death Swiftness. Sometimes I only do 1, because yes, it is a strong ability. However, it is 65% adrenaline, it's a lot of adren cost, so it's something I like to use as kind of a dump to kill something, or just it once or twice in a rotation and focus on other Thresh usage and ECB usage during a DS. Alrighty, so this rotation that I'm going to do assumes you only have dual-wield weapons. Most likely they're going to be Ascensions, however, Blights are not that much difference in damage compared to Ascension crossbows. So this also assumes no Grico in what I would do for that, but it does assume a Debo EOF, being that it is rather cheap to get. So if you have Grico, if you're at the point in the progression where you have Grico, I would just follow the previous rotation and just not use Debo specs and prioritize more threshold usage and go about it that way. So go ahead and get our target. And here I'm going to go for 2 snaps, 2 rapids, 10 Ds, tight bindings. I might even toss a dead shot. We'll see what happens. So go ahead and start the DS. Immediately needle into a snipe, snap, and a rapid. Needle. I have a lot of adrenaline, so I'll go ahead and hit a Debo. I timed this odd, so kind of build up. Go ahead and hit 10 Ds. Snap, rapid, and about 5 seconds left. Go ahead and needle into another Debo. And then I would go ahead and at this point and then build into something else, like a dead shot or whatever. Whatever would fit the bill best for you. So real quick, I'm going to talk about Relic Usage with range. Now, this is just my elite dungeons. I'm scared to death of getting cheese and tomato bada type of relics. This is not for top-end performance by any stretch of the imagination. This is just for casual KC farming at elite dungeons and being extremely fearful for no reason of like a 1 in 7 zillion kajillion drop rate. So what I would typically use, now that we have Deadshot available as an ability to use that is affected by COE, I would most likely opt for COE over the 110%. Honestly, I don't even remember the name of it. Heightened Senses, that's what it is. So I would go for COE over Heightened Senses with range. There is kind of a debate between Heightened Senses and COE. Some of the best rangers in game, I'm not exactly sure what they think on this. However, you could easily check them out. Rangers such as Luca or Seni or any of those other people who are really kind of in the top half or the top 0.1% of rangers that I know of. Also, Addo, I forget how many ones are in his name, but he was an ED1 speedrunner, Pernix as well. There's a lot of people out there who are significantly better at range than I am, so maybe look to what they have to say on something for Heightened Senses versus COE or something like that. However, for me personally, I run COE almost all the time. Sometimes I will go ahead and pop Death Ward if I'm just at a different boss like Glaycor or somewhere else that's not elite dungeons. I'll pop that in the first slot instead of Luck of the Doors, and then I'll either put Fury of the Small, or depending on what my perk setup is, which will be changing in the future, I might toss something like Shadow's Grace into place. Range can benefit more from Fury of the Small compared to Magic because the Adren gain is a bit more RNG because you're talking about a bolt proc versus a crit chance. And crit chance can be a lot more consistent for gaining adrenaline than a bolt proc can be. So sometimes I will just opt for Death Ward in the first slot and then Fury of the Small in the third slot with conservation in the middle. And that's how I typically run my perk setup. However, there's a lot more educated people out there who could probably tell you the best. I've heard of cases where COE would be in the middle, something like Berserker's Fury would be in slot 1, and then you run Font of Life or Shadow's Grace. That's kind of your freebie choice. As far as I'm aware, that is the actual best in slot relic meta, is to do Zerk Fury, COE, and Font of Life or Shadow's Grace, depending on perk setup. For right now, I believe that is the best damage perk meta. However, I'm not entirely sure if it's applicable 100% to range. However, with range being that you're using ECB a lot, your HP is most likely going to be pretty low, so I imagine Zerk Fury would be a relatively good idea for an extra 3 to 5% damage on all of your abilities. So as far as familiar usage is concerned with range, I will pretty much unanimously use Ripper Demon with range over Calgurian, just because I don't believe the crit chance increase from Calg will offset the damage output Ripper can use. So again, I'm not entirely 100% sure on this. However, I will almost always use Ripper Demon in combination with Spiritual Prayers for the range combat style. Now, you could also use something, I've heard a lot of people talking about Blood Reaver and it apparently can put out a decent amount of damage while keeping you safe. So for something like range where you're camping low HP and you're able to you'd be able to sustain lower HP easier, and you're using ECB spec a lot where you're not healing back with soul split, you're kind of just hoping for the best and hoping you don't die in a sense. I could see Blood Reaver being a alternative choice that would be pretty effective. However, I am not sure what the damage output of Blood Reaver would be. It seems more of a quality of life and sustainability familiar compared to a raw damage familiar. However, some people have said that this can put out a decent amount of damage on its own, so I'll have to see what testing comes of it in the future and whatnot. But for the quick down and dirty, Ripper Demon all the time, you can play with Blood Reaver if you want, and then they're not in here, but Shadow Nihil if you're at like Rago or Nex or something, where familiar damage isn't usable, or Araxa or something like that. I would say Nihil for those specific cases, but that's kind of niche. But Ripper all the way with some Blood Reaver experimenting. An interesting talking point with range is the fact that it has a bit more freedom when it comes to aura selection than the other two combat styles, being that with magic, 99% of the time, if not 100% of the time, I'm using Maniacal. Melee has to use Berserker aura, or that's about it. There are some cases where you can use Majorot if you're hybrid, but 99% of the time, Berserker and Maniacal I am using with the respective combat styles. Now with range, I do use Reckless a lot. However, I have noticed a lot of people getting away with using either Inspiration or Invigorate to decent effect, being that they're both adrenaline gaining auras, which for range being on a pretty RNG heavy bolt proc type gain for adrenaline, I can see both of these being very useful in certain situations. I have not figured out ideal rotations for them by any means. However, I have seen some pretty quick boss times at some pretty decent bosses using these auras over something like Reckless. And also, these type of auras synergize rather well with something like Scripture Full Usage, because when this Scripture procs, you take more damage as a consequence of doing more damage. It's kind of like a mini Berserk in a pocket slot, so to speak. So with these auras or any other aura, you're not taking increased damage like you are with Reckless, being that you physically take 15% more damage and your defense level does go down when using an aura like this. However, if you just want to full send some damage, Reckless is the way to go. However, I would definitely recommend experimenting with Invigorate and Inspiration, assuming that accuracy is not an issue at the boss you plan on using it at. So for Nex, Rax, and Rago, places like that, Telos, Reckless is pretty much your best bet. However, at places where accuracy doesn't matter, such as some of the God Wars 3 bosses, or places like Elite Dungeons, ED1 and ED3, both you can use auras like these two, or Majorot if you want to, and they would be fine. The only issue you would run into specifically with ED3, I know I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but Crassian Leviathan has some accuracy. However, you could just bring any type of bow. It could be a Nox bow, it could be Strike bow, it could be SGB physically, and some BSAs, and you could get that extra accuracy if you wanted. So there are options there for you. The last topic I wanted to cover is bolt and arrow usage within the combat styles. So 99% of the time I'm using Hydrix bolts, and I pretty much will just camp Hydrix bolts. I don't typically bolt swap anymore. I've gotten pretty lazy about it. Ruby bolts are good, however, I typically only switch to them during my SGB specs. There it is. Yeah, when I use SGB spec, I will tend to, if I am going to swap for it, I will swap to Ruby. so that way I can possibly get a proc on it, because Ruby SGB Spec is if SGB Spec is already nutty in terms of damage output, but a Ruby Spec, it's insane what it can do. It's literally, if you get all crits, it's 90k damage in basically one tick. It's a nutty thing to do. However, I am kind of relaxed when using this style, so I typically don't do it. Onyx bolts are nice as a backup to have in case you really need some HP, and they also have a convenient thing where if they proc and they heal you, they also do an additional 25% damage on a proc. So what I know has been done in the past, I don't know if it's still the method, but what people would do is wait for a Ruby proc, then swap to Onyx bolts, and until the cooldown for Ruby is over with, and then save Hydrix for Grico and Rapid. And I'm not sure if that's still the method, but it is a smart usage of all three, being that you're maximizing the damage potential of the two bolts that can increase damage of hits. So the reason you would swap to Onyx in the first place is I believe Ruby has a cooldown, and I believe it is a group cooldown, meaning if someone Ruby procs, it's a cooldown for everyone. I could be wrong on this though. I don't do much group content, and it's been quite a while since I've heard this discussed, but I believe it is either a 6 or 10-second cooldown that Ruby bolts can't proc anymore. Or they can't proc back to back, you know, like every 4 game ticks or anything like that. Like once they proc, there's a mandatory cooldown period for the bolt. So then you would swap to Onyx so you can get more damage out, and then Hydrix for trying to get adrenaline, because Rapid Fire and Grico are your main two abilities that are going to build adrenaline from Hydrix. It's your Grico procs and your Rapids. So just something to keep in mind. I'm pretty lazy, and I will swap to Hydrix and just camp them inside of a Pernix Quiver. And I also carry BSAs in there for some places where I need to get some extra accuracy. And as far as other arrows are concerned, there are Death Spore and Splintering arrows. I have played with Splintering arrows in the past. I used them at Glaycore while camping a Hex Hunter bow, and it was fun. It did good damage, but I didn't really notice too much difference. And then there are some people who have played with Death Spore arrows and Splintering arrows at Solak before Magic became the meta. I think it was Brain RS was the guy who was messing around with these and found some pretty decent success. I believe that him and the others on his team were able to get some records before, you know, the whole Magic meta came out to be, and these kind of got shot to the wayside. But they're definitely something you can play with. Splintering arrows affect greater dazing shot and allow it so you have more time before you have to apply another greater dazing shot to keep the number of stacks up. So it makes it much more user-friendly for incorporating that with Salt the Wound inside of any type of rotation. Death Spore, I'm not entirely sure how a rotation is formed around it, but it has an effect where once you get to 5 stacks, the adrenaline cost of the next ability goes down to 0. So if you could time that with like a Debo spec or something like that and have a 0% a usage Debo, that is massive. So I imagine these arrows are very good. I just have not heard a whole lot, and I don't believe the community has really explored them too much as of right now, because range as a whole is on the back burner right now while Magic is in the spotlight. Range was very much a 2020-2021 combat style, and that's when it had its big highlight in recent years. So, you know, once some T95s pop up for the style, I'm sure it'll pop right back into the spotlight and everyone will focus and rave about how great it is, and also complain that it's overpowered, but I digress. Alrighty, ladies and gents, and I did not forget about you, Scriptures of Full. That was a lot of information and brain splatter coming out of my mouth here for you all to listen to. However, I'd like to do a quick recap. So as far as gear is concerned, I pretty much use best in slot. However, in the rotations later on in the video, you can see that it doesn't matter really what gear you have, as long as you're putting your best foot forward in terms of ability prioritization and building a rotation. Range can do good damage all across the board and is probably the most universal combat style. As far as rotations are concerned, if you have an SGB and you're at a boss or fighting a target that can be effective efficiently at attacking that target, meaning that it's a 3x3 or greater sized hitbox on the boss, then go ahead and go for 2 SGBs or DS. The thing you have to keep in mind is it is a 30-second cooldown, so it has to be the third ability in your DS, so that way it has enough time to come off cooldown in the 37-second window to then be used at kind of the tail end of your death swift. And other than that, focusing on 2 snaps, a rapid or 2, attendees, and as many debos as your Hydrix procs will allow. Typically, I do only 1 or 2 debos per death swift, and also I probably focus on using ECB a bit too much in DS. However, I like to do 2 different specs, so most of the entire DS is under ECB. Without SGB, say you're fighting a 1x1 or a 2x2 target, or you don't happen to own one yet, focusing on 2 snaps, 2 rapids, attendees, and as many Gricos as you can fit in there while under ECB spec, and as many Debos as Hydrix procs will allow, is going to be your main priority. And then say you don't have ECB or Grico, then the same concept is going to apply. You're just going to have to change your basic rotation to kind of cover the fact that you aren't using Ricochet or Grico to get Adrenaline, or to have it as a very strong basic, which is not impossible. It just you have to be more poignant with your basic selection and understand what your target is susceptible of, considering the fact if it is stunnable or bindable, and using the kind of binding shot, piercing shot meta accordingly, that things of the sort. And then as far as familiars, I use Ripper, and I've heard of people using Blood Reaver. It seems nice for sustainability, however, I haven't tested it yet. And then if you need the accuracy, then go ahead and pull out a Nihil. Relics, I keep it pretty casual. COE is a staple and will almost never change. And if you want to go pretty try-hard, you can toss in Zerk Fury with Font of Life or Shadow's Grace, depending on which one you need. And then for a more relaxed setup that's more casual friendly, but is also still very good in terms of damage, Fury of the Small and Death Ward is a very nice setup for keeping you safe during ECB spam and whatnot. Other than that, bolt usage, as I just discussed in depth. I camp Hydrix all the time because I'm kind of lazy with this combat style. However, if you want to swap between Ruby, Onyx, and Hydrix, Rubies are great for SGB specs and in general purpose procs. And if it does proc, it has a cooldown, so you can swap over to Onyx for the time being in between Rubies, and then use Hydrix for your Gricos and your rapid fires. Try and gain some adrenaline. And that's about it. As far as I can think, I'm pretty sure that's everything that from this guide in kind of a TLDR type of format. Ladies, gentlemen, and I did not forget about you, Scriptures of Full. Thank you very much for watching this guide. Your viewership is greatly appreciated. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, whatever it is, wherever you are, and I will see you for the next guide or video. Peace.